Dr. Henry Wu is a character who played a very important role in Michael Crichton's original novel. He was, however, left out of much of the plot of the film adaptation that came out back in 1993. Because of this, some of the events of that original book have been retooled and repurposed in later sequels that have sought to expand upon areas of the initial novel story that were left unexplored. Much of this story revolved around the ignorance of Henry Wu's character and how his blind ambition would eventually lead to the downfall of InGen's tourist attraction. The overly proud and aspirational man of science would eventually meet his creation head-on, and while his arc was left untouched in Steven Spielberg's initial Jurassic film, the punishment that he would receive for meddling in things that he simply could not control is actually alluded to in that first movie. Wu stared out of the lodge windows and at the raptors beyond the fence. Ellie had lured them there in an attempt to distract the animals while Dr. Grant went to the maintenance shed to restore power. They appeared quite playful, making mock attacks at Dr. Sattler. This behavior had continued for a long time now, and he began to wonder if it was possibly too long. It almost seemed as if they were trying to keep Sattler's attention, just as she was trying to keep theirs. But what did it matter? The behavior had always been a minor consideration for Dr. Wu, and rightfully so. Behavior was only a second-order effect of DNA, like protein unfolding. You can't really predict behavior, and you really can't even control it, except in very crude ways, like he'd geniusly done by making them dependent on lysine for survival. But generally speaking, behavioral effects were quite simply beyond the reach of understanding. You can't look at a DNA sequence and predict behavior. It's impossible. This had made Wu's creations purely empirical. He was dealing with something out of the past, something constructed of ancient materials that followed ancient rules. He didn't know why exactly it worked the way it did, and it had already been modified many times over by the forces of evolution for eons before his work began. So like the workman who makes an adjustment to see if the clock runs any better, Wu would duly make his adjustments to see if the animal's behavior was more satisfactory. And he only tried to control gross behavior, like butting of the fences or rubbing the skin raw on tree trunks. That was the kind of stuff that sent him back to the drawing board. And the limits of his science had left him with a mysterious feeling about his dinosaurs in the park. He was never sure, never really sure at all, if these animals' behavior was historically accurate or not. Were they behaving as they had done in the past? It was an open question that was ultimately impossible to answer. And though Wu would never admit it, the discovery that the animals were breeding represented a tremendous validation of his work. A breeding animal was demonstrably effective in a fundamental way. In fact, it implied that Wu had put all the pieces back together correctly. He'd done it. He had recreated an animal millions of years old with such precision that the dinosaur could reproduce itself. And yet, he was still troubled. These velociraptors were becoming quite persistent. Now, raptors were intelligent, and intelligent animals got bored quickly. Intelligent animals also formed plans. Suddenly, Harding ran into the hallway from Malcolm's room. "Where's Ellie?" he asked. "She's still outside," replied the doctor. "Better get her in. The raptors have left the skylight." The scientist became panicked. He knew they had to be up to something, and that meant Dr. Sattler had to be in danger. Wu threw open the door. "Ellie, inside, now!" She looked at him quite puzzled. "There's no problem," she replied. "Everything is under control." "Now!" the scientist screamed. "I know what I'm doing," she yelled back, just before Wu screamed again. "Now, damn it!" Muldoon didn't like Wu standing there with the door open, and he was just about to say so, before he saw a terrible shadow descend from above. In an instant, Wu's body was yanked out of the doorway, and Muldoon heard Ellie screaming. He ran to the door and witnessed this turn of events play out. Wu lay on his back, feebly reaching his hands out to keep the heavy snout of the velociraptor at bay. But it didn't matter. The animal thrust down its sickle claw and cut into the scientist's body, its head jerking at the organs that used to be inside of the geneticist. It was tugging at Wu's intestines. And Wu was still alive. He was still alive when they'd started to eat him. Ellie stopped screaming and turned to run in the other direction just as Muldoon slammed the door shut, dizzy with horror. It had happened so fast. In an instant, the power had shifted hands, and Wu was gone. His pathetic attempts to push back against his attackers went unsuccessful, and now, in the process of being eaten, one could say that all he really wanted was to live. But they simply denied him that. The death of Dr. Henry Wu is, in my opinion, one of the most iconic and undoubtedly horrifying parts of the original novel. Upon reading this moment as a kid, it honestly surprised me and added a whole lot of weight to the warning Alan Grant gave that kid at the dig site during the first act of the movie. Ever since then, the words, "You are alive," when they start to eat you, instantly reminds me of Wu's untimely demise. His death is also one that is unquestionably poetic in presentation to the reader. Not only was he killed by the very thing that he'd created, it happened right after he'd had a really terrible moment of gross vanity. Wu was so focused on his genetic work that he took the discovery of the animal's breeding as a positive rather than a clear indication that his control over the dinosaurs had now come into question. In his eyes, he'd created a perfect organism, one that was rebuilt by his ingenious design from the ground up, and he ultimately paid the price for valuing such science over a clear understanding of reality. And that reality came down from above to literally tear him to pieces. I have a pretty good feeling that Dr. Wu is fated to meet this situation or a version of it in Jurassic World 3 in a couple of years' time. And seeing as there are talks of bringing back Alan Grant for that film, I can imagine a reprise of the words he told the unruly child at the start of Jurassic Park to come back and bite Dr. Wu in the worst way imaginable. Now, before I go, I want to thank my game wardens, as well as all of my InGen executives. I'd also like to thank all of my park workers and InGen hunters as well. Words can't really express how awesome it is to have you guys help me build this thing up, and I seriously am incredibly thankful for every ounce of support that you've shown me. Seriously guys, it means a lot. Now, I'd like to thank you all for watching this video, and hope that you all enjoyed today's content. If you feel like I deserve it, I'd appreciate the like and hope that you'll consider subscribing if you're interested in hearing from me again. I'll see you all in the next video, guys. As always, take it easy.